Well, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. We're very pleased to have Dr. Jessica Barnes with us from across the road down the street, Planetary Sciences here on campus. Dr. Barnes received her undergraduate degree from the University of St. Andrews in 2011 and the Open University in UK in 2015. She then completed a couple of different postdocs with the Lunar and Planetary Institute and the Johnson Space Flight Center in Houston. And then she joined the Planetary Sciences Lunar and Planetary Lab here at the U of A in 2019, so 2 years ago. She's a member of two different big time missions with NASA, the Apollo Next Generation Sample Analysis mission, and also now, of course, she's part of the OSIRIS-REx team at LPL. Dr. Barnes is going to talk about her research today on the moon. She's interested in many other aspects of planetary science and geochemistry, cosmochemistry. For graduate students, she teaches a course on cosmochemistry, the core course in planetary science in that field. That may be a great offering for many of our geosciences students. She has recently been honored with the NASA Early Career Award in 2020, so congratulations for that award. And I'll just pass it over to Jessica to get started.
Perfect. Thank you very much, George, for that introduction. Can you still hear me okay? Okay, perfect. Yes, and thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk today. I've just minimized the people window, so if you have a question, feel free to just shout it out because I can't see the chat or anything. So thank you again. Today I'm going to talk about some of the research I've been doing and one of my interests most recently in chlorine isotopes on the moon and using that isotope system to understand the magmatic and volcanic evolution of our nearest planetary body. So to take a step back for anyone in the audience who's maybe not familiar with lunar history, the moon we think formed via a giant impact event with the proto-Earth, and that's really nicely depicted on the left here in the schematic where you see an object having impacted with the proto-Earth and then material being flung out in a very violent way. The canonical model suggests that the moon or the Earth was impacted by a body roughly the size of Mars, and in that canonical model is believed that the moon largely formed from the impactor Theia material. But as people over the last 20 or so years have been analyzing the isotopic composition of moon rocks from the Apollo missions, from the Lunar missions, and lunar meteorites, it's become evident that that's not quite the case. In a lot of isotope systems, in the stable isotope systems, we see almost indistinguishable compositions between terrestrial rocks and moon rocks. And so that doesn't quite fit with the canonical moon formation model where we have the moon forming largely from an impactor material from elsewhere in the solar system. And so newer models or variants on the canonical model use the speed and velocity of the impacts, use different sized impactors as well to come up with models where, like you see on the right, the moon is forming largely from proto-Earth material, so Earth mantle material, as opposed to Theia material. And so that's kind of our starting off point for understanding, well, what happened to lunar material after the giant impact event? And so the initial stage is that material would have formed a silicate disk and a proto-lunar disk about the Earth. Once the proto-moon, if you like, had formed, you can imagine this body has accreted and might look something like you see on the bottom left of your screen. I really like this image from NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center because it kind of depicts what was happening as the moon was starting to cool and starting to form what we all know and love to be rock. And so when we think about this world that would have been forming, it would have been really hot. And so we think the moon largely went through what's called a lunar magma ocean phase. And so as this moon starts cooling and crystallizing, the first minerals that would have formed would be, so you would have first formed the core, but then after that, you would have had ferromagnesium minerals like olivines and pyroxenes forming out of the liquid and sinking to form a stratified lunar mantle. At around 70 to 80% solidification, plagioclase would start to crystallize in the liquid, but would be less dense, and so would float in that denser liquid to form accumulate crust, largely of plagioclase anorthite composition. And then finally, the last dregs of the lunar magma ocean would have been enriched in all those elements that didn't want to go into the mantle material or the crustal material, so incompatible elements like potassium, phosphorus, the rare earth elements, probably volatile elements like hydrogen, chlorine, fluorine, but also iron and titanium. And so we think that the moon would have ended up with this creep material as a residual layer and also an ilmenite layer. And I should just mention before I move on to the fourth point in this figure that all of these kind of steps in the formation of the lunar magma ocean and its crystallization have been explored through experimental petrology. And Ananya Malik is doing some of these experiments at the moment. So hopefully you're thinking to yourselves, well, we have an ilmenite layer on top of a less dense mantle, and that isn't quite kosher. And so gravitational instability, with having more dense material over less dense material would have been corrected by having some kind of overturn event. So having that ilmenite founder in some way through the mantle to correct that instability. And so we think that's how we ended up with a pretty heterogeneous lunar interior and source region for later volcanism. So when we look up at the moon, we can see the two main rock types on the moon. We can see, we're all familiar with looking up at the moon and seeing the darker regions and the lighter regions. Well, those darker regions are big impact basins that are filled now with volcanic deposits, filled with volcanic lava flows and pyroclastics, what we term the Mare basalts. And then the lighter regions are the lunar crust. The lunar crust is somewhat older than the majority of lunar basalts or volcanic rocks that we have. The crust dates from about 4.5, so right early on, probably during this initial crustal phase, forming the Pharon and orthosites. And then we also have what we call secondary crust. So into that initial primary Pharon and orthosite crust, we would have had intrusions into that crust forming the secondary crust. And we call that those suites of samples magnesium or alkali suites because they're dominated by ferromagnesium minerals and then also more felsic materials as well for the alkali suite. But generally speaking, all the crustal materials are somewhat older, and then our maria or our volcanic deposits generally formed around between 4 and 3 billion years ago, but there are outliers. Some older lunar meteorites have been detected with ages of about 4.35 billion years. And then we see some pretty young volcanic deposits on the surface of the moon, which may be on the order of 100 million years old. So that's the basics of lunar geology. But what does that have to do with chlorine? So I wanted to introduce the idea why volatiles are important when studying extraterrestrial materials. So in cosmochemistry and geochemistry, we think of volatile elements as having 50% condensation temperatures less than about 1300 Kelvin. And so what I mean by half condensation temperatures is if we take a gas of solar composition, the volatile elements will condense out, 50% will condense out at temperatures less than 1300 Kelvin. In the terrestrial planets and some meteorite parent bodies, we see that they're extremely volatile depleted. And knowing that the moon is volatile depleted is not something new, but is depicted on this figure. So you can see that refractory elements, those are the ones that would have condensed out at high temperatures. And then the more volatile elements obviously are coming out at lower temperatures. This figure is relative to CI chondrites and silicon. And so we're saying that compared to the solar value, that the moon, which is highlighted in the black circles, is volatile depleted relative to the one line, which would be CI chondrites. And we can see that better depicted on the far right-hand side, where you see that the moon lies between Earth and angrites and the HED meteorites. in terms of its volatile depletion. I'm really interested in looking at magmatic volatiles, so things like hydrogen, fluorine, chlorine, sulfur, because these really influence the physiochemical processes and stabilities of minerals, melts, volcanic eruptions, that kind of thing, not just on Earth, but on other planetary bodies as well. And volatile elements such as those are really important to understanding how the planets and the small bodies formed and evolved. And most of my research is looking at isotopes of volatile elements. And so these are really important for helping us to understand the sources of volatiles like water in our solar system, and also to identify processes that might have changed those volatile signatures or fractionated them over time. The study of lunar endogenous volatiles, so lunar volatiles, is not something new. People were doing this during the Apollo time, so during the early 1970s and through to the 1980s. But the analytical techniques available at the time were not conducive to measuring indigenous water in lunar samples. And so it's only been since the late 2000s that we've known that lunar samples contain tiny amounts of water that's indigenous to the moon. And so the earliest studies of lunar water in lunar samples was in 2008, Alberto Sal's seminal paper on volcanic glass beads from the Apollo 17 site, where he measured very small amounts, parts per million water in these lunar volcanic beads. And this study was later followed up by a study led by Eric Hyrey at Carnegie Institute, Washington, where he looked at melt inclusions trapped within olivine crystals found within these glass beads. But this work, while it was happening in the late 2000s, was really prompted by the discovery of water all over the lunar surface in very small amounts by spacecraft orbiting the moon. And so we've really been in a decade of rediscovering what the lunar volatile budget is, prompted by early missions and these amazing results from the earliest papers in the early 2000s. But this talk is all about chlorine, so I'm going to move away from water. But those discoveries are important because it really prompted us to go back in these modern techniques, ion microprobe techniques, bulk rock analysis techniques that have evolved since the 1970s, and apply those again to samples that have been on Earth for about 50 years. And after those initial studies that detected water and said, yes, there's lunar water there, it prompted some groups to start looking at the halogens as well, and including chlorine. And so the halogens are important to this topic of lunar formation and evolution because they're fluid mobile elements. And so they're really useful for probing potential hydrous or metasomatic geologic processes. And as I said before, they're also important magmatic volatiles as well. On the moon, we're most concerned with fluorine and chlorine because they're found in the highest abundances, and chlorine is found in the highest concentrations of all halogens on the moon. Chlorine and fluorine are also really important as well because they're found in late-stage minerals within all the different rock types that we find on the moon. They're found in chlorine and fluorine occur in the mineral apatite, which you can see the chemical formula here. It's calcium phosphate mineral that contains fluorine, chlorine, and some hydroxyl within its crystal structure. So they're essential structural constituents of this mineral. And apatite's really important to lunar studies because it's the only hydrous-bearing mineral we have in lunar samples that occurs in commonly throughout different rock types over different ages and from different Apollo missions and in the lunar meteorites. So it's a really important tool for understanding volatile evolution on the moon. So a little bit more on chlorine isotopes in astromaterials. So astromaterials just being a fancy word for combining terrestrial materials with extraterrestrial materials. Chlorine has two stable isotopes, and these can be fractionated from each other. In this case, we're going to talk about magmatic processes. For those who aren't familiar, we usually are looking at very small differences in isotope ratios between the less common isotope and the more common isotope. So in this case, the more common isotope is chlorine-35 and the less common is chlorine-37. And we're usually comparing a sample to a known standard, in this case, standard mean ocean chloride. And we convert that to what we call a per mil value, or a delta notation, shown over here, delta chlorine-37, because the differences that we're looking at between the sample and the standard are so small that it's more conducive to use integers and to have those differences represented in a delta notation. And so we'll use per mil as well. So chlorine isotopes, it was found from in an initial paper by Zach Sharp in 2007 in Science, I think, that the Earth displays a relatively small range in chlorine isotope compositions. And then in this 2010 paper that Zach led, you can see, so 0 would be standard mean ocean chloride. Anything to the left of this plot is going to be depleted in chlorine-37, and anything to the right is going to be have more chlorine-37 relative to chlorine-35. And you can see that mid-ocean ridge basalts, the Earth's mantle, even mantle halites, even Earth's crust, all lie around this 0 value. What's interesting, though, from this 2010 paper is that a lot of meteorites also plot around this 0 value, including some CAIs, which calcium aluminium rich inclusions, which are the oldest solids in our solar system. Some of their alteration products also lie close to that 0 value. A more recent compilation that's from a paper in PrEP shows you that more carbonaceous chondrites, ordinary chondrites, enstatite chondrites, the building blocks for the planet, all have chlorine isotope compositions that are relatively unfractionated, meaning they all lie around the 0 value. But we can see now that there's some more variation in extraterrestrial materials than we've previously seen. So the iron meteorites, which are the red circles and the pink diamonds, show a wider range of chlorine isotope compositions than the terrestrial samples and chondritic meteorites. We also have samples from the asteroid Vesta, represented by the eucrites, which also show more fractionated values, and also some Martian meteorites also show more fractionated values. But the moon is a conundrum. So in the 2010 paper, Zach Sharp showed that the moon shows the widest, and it's even wider than this now, goes up to plus 80 per mil at the moment. The moon displays wider chlorine isotope variation than we've seen on any other planetary body or meteorite samples. And so the question is, what processes cause this fractionation of chlorine on the moon? And can we identify those processes and relate them back to how the moon formed and evolved? And so that's going to be the topic of today's discussion. So how I approach this problem is to, I should mention that Zach's work was primarily looking at bulk rock analyses, and those are really good, but I really wanted to delve into the topic of chlorine on the moon, because we know the moon is volatile depleted, because we've seen these large fractionations in bulk samples, and apply in situ techniques to have textual context for trying to pick apart these different processes that might be happening over geological time. So to do that, I used a range of different samples, some relatively younger Mare basalts from different Apollo sites, and then also some of the crustal samples that are much older, and applied a range of analytical techniques. And so this is probably not surprising to a lot of people. It's a pretty standard way to go about analyzing volatiles in samples. So I usually take a thin section, and then I'll use a scanning electron microscope to take X-ray maps or use energy dispersive spectroscopy to gain X-ray maps that relate to specific elements, and then I'll overlay those to form a mineral composite map like the one you see in the center, where different elements are indicated by different colors, and then they've been overlain. And what I'm looking for primarily are the chlorine hosts, and so I'm most interested in looking for apatite, which is usually coming out in these yellow minerals, so you can see indicated by the calcium hotspots. And then I'll go in and do some detailed imaging using backscattered electron imaging and also secondary electron imaging. Both are really important. You can see how the backscattered electron imaging is really useful for getting an idea of the surrounding mineralogy, but also to look for any zonations. You can see some zonations in this apatite here. And the secondary electron imaging is really good to understand the surface topography and the presence of cracks and fractures throughout the apatites. The tool of choice that I use to understand the volatile element chemistry is a nanoscale secondary ion mass spectrometer. And it's very similar in how it works to other ion microprobes like a 1280, except in this case, NanoSIMS still uses a primary ion beam of cesium, but instead of impinging the sample at an angle, in NanoSIMS, we're using a coaxial system. And so the NanoSIMS primary beam impinges at 90 degrees to the sample surface. And then we're sputtering away, literally removing atoms to then look at the secondary ions that come off the sample using a mass spectrometer. And so for this work, we're mostly looking at relative abundances of chlorine 35 and 37. You might be asking, well, why are you using a NanoSIMS rather than a traditional SIMS instrument? And hopefully the middle figure on the bottom shows you why. NanoSIMS has a much higher spatial resolution than traditional SIMS instruments, which means for extraterrestrial materials, which are largely going to have suffered some kind of impact history, and you can see that clearly in this apatite from a norite from Apollo 17, they're heavily fractured. And so NanoSIMS has the spatial resolution to allow us to navigate away from those fractures and analyze indigenous material, which is especially important if you're looking at volatiles. You don't want to be analyzing something that's coming from cracks. And then afterwards, after analysis, I'll go to the electron microprobe to get quantitative mineral chemistry data. So to jump to the point, in this the initial study that we did was to look at a range of different samples. You can see we've got basaltic samples, different creep-rich samples, and also some highland samples indicated by the pink and purples. We looked at this range to cover the major rock type ranges, but also a range in ages. So we're looking at rocks that range from about 4.3 billion years old all the way to 3.3-ish billion years old. This plot is showing you the apatite chlorine content versus its chlorine isotope composition on the y-axis. And you can see, remember, Earth is around here. The chlorine isotope variations in these samples is wild. Our work shows that the in situ chlorine isotopes from apatite vary according to rock type. The largest spread in chlorine content is shown by the crustal samples that show a relatively restricted range in chlorine isotope compositions, except for the pink diamonds, which represent impact process samples. And then you can see, relatively speaking, the Mare basalts, the basaltic volcanic samples, they're all plotting at lower chlorine isotope compositions and relatively restricted apatite chlorine contents. Recently, in a follow-up study to the one I just showed you, Alice Stefan and colleagues at the Open University started looking at melt inclusions within some of the basaltic samples that we'd previously looked at in 2016. And one of the big questions that came out of our 2016 study was, you're looking at apatite crystals that we know form in the very last stages of, if we're looking at a basalt, the very last gasps of that basalt, that's where the apatite's going to be forming. It's a very refractory element or mineral. And so maybe what you're seeing in the chlorine isotope variation in the volcanic samples is just due to volatile loss as you're extruding that basalt to the surface, and then that lava is cooling on the surface of the moon. So to kind of investigate that further, Alice Stefan and colleagues looked at the melt inclusions found in some of these basalts using the same instrument at the Open University. They find lower chlorine concentrations, but generally speaking, for the Mare basalts, they saw mostly the same range in chlorine isotope compositions that we were seeing in the apatite grains. And this shows that chlorine content changes as fractional crystallization proceeds. So we have a lot lower abundances of chlorine in the melt inclusions, the very pockets of the very first melt to form. But then we have much more chlorine in the residual apatites at the end. But there appears to be minimal fractionation of chlorine isotopes within the magmas themselves, although there are some samples that do show evidence for having degassed chlorine on their way to the surface or at the surface. So Alice's work plus our work showed that the melt had to have already been fractionated with its chlorine isotopes before these rocks formed. And so what's the source of this fractionated chlorine on the moon, and how did magmas obtain those compositions? Well, a study that came out just before ours in 2015, and Alice's work and our work, we all realized that we were studying a range of sample types, lunar basalts that have varying amounts of creep component, that residual lunar magma ocean component, and crustal rocks. And so we kind of all decided that, there's a good proxy for creep component if we look at the trace elements. So by comparing the chlorine isotope compositions, and just to confuse everyone, chlorine isotopes are now on the x-axis for the Boyce data, and they're still on the y-axis for the Stefan data. But you can see that if we use, for example, thorium or lanthanum-lutetium ratios, or we use lanthanum over samarium, that we see a correlation between trace elements, rare earth elements, and also chlorine isotope compositions. And so what does all of this mean? So I want to take a step back and go back to the lunar magma ocean. So you'll remember that I was talking about how the magma ocean forms and how the crust forms, and that we're left with this residual air creep component towards the end. Well, we know that chlorine is very incompatible in olivine and pyroxene, even more incompatible than water and fluorine in those minerals. And it's also incompatible in feldspar. And so chlorine, throughout the progressive crystallization of the lunar magma ocean, would be preferentially concentrated in this air creep layer at the end. And so this is our largest reservoir of chlorine inside the moon. So realizing this, the trend that we see in between the chlorine isotope compositions and the trace elements is telling us that air creep, the primitive form of creep from the lunar magma ocean, likely had a very fractionated chlorine isotope composition of around plus 25, plus 30 per mil. And the mantle of the moon is likely characterized by unfractionated to even depleted values, maybe down to -4 per mil. Okay, and I've already kind of gone through that already. So how might air creep form? We know air creep would be concentrated in chlorine, but how would it be fractionated in chlorine isotopes? Since magmatic, how would it be fractionated in chlorine isotopes? And so we undertook some really distillation modeling to see if we could compute this and try and trace the chlorine isotope fractionation. And so what we did was if you're not familiar with the Rayleigh equation, R is the chlorine isotope composition remaining in a melt. R0 is the initial chlorine isotope composition before any crystallization, before any loss has occurred. F is the fraction, and then this alpha factor is the relationship, the square root of one of the isotopologues to the other, the mass of those isotopologues. And so when you compute the loss of chlorine from melts that have a range of chlorine contents, we can see that as we lose chlorine species like zinc chloride or iron chloride or even sodium chloride from lunar melts, that it's an easy way to fractionate chlorine isotopes. So with progressive loss, you're losing chlorine from the system, and you're preferentially losing the lighter isotope over the heavier isotope. So what you're doing over progressive degassing is you're losing chlorine 35 relative to chlorine 37. So any residual liquid remaining after, say, 97% of degassing is going to be enriched in chlorine 37, and you'll have a higher delta chlorine 37 value. And that's what's being recorded by apatites and melt inclusions. But when did this degassing or volatile loss occur? Okay, so we postulated that so we've already established that air creep is likely has very fractionated chlorine. So it had to happen either during the lunar magma ocean, we have degassing from that magma ocean, or it had to happen shortly after the air creep reservoir had formed. And in our 2016 paper, we argued that the latter is more reasonable because you have to concentrate the chlorine before you lose it. And not just that, but early on in the moon's history, while the lunar magma ocean was solidifying, there would have been an atmosphere around the moon. And so that would have prevented the loss of chlorine from the system. Any chlorine lost to that atmosphere would likely have rained back into the magma ocean and been mixed in again, canceling out any fractionated chlorine isotope signal. And so we went a step further to say that not only would impacts have been important, but potentially large cross-breaching impacts could have facilitated the loss of the lighter chlorine isotope to space, maybe depositing on the surrounding cold crust and fractionating the remaining air creep that was left behind. So that was kind of the story in 2016, and we had a follow-up paper in 2019 that corroborated that. But one thing we were always met with was, well, what if the samples where we're recording these high values, whether that's just a crustal process that's happening and it's not anything to do with air creep? And so to try and tackle that question, we decided to look at magnesium sweet rocks, one in particular. So just a little background on what they are. So they're distinguished from other lunar rocks by their mineralogy, their textures, and their geochemistry. They're the magnesium sweet crustal rocks, and they have a range of ages from about 4.2 to 4.5 billion years old. And these are some of the rocks that we think were formed by this secondary cross production. So this model from Steve Alardo kind of depicts this idea that they're a mixture of very primitive materials from the mantle and this very residual air creep layer. And so we think that during overturn, some of those very primitive, early formed mantle cumulates were being brought up close to the surface, or at least close to the base of the crust, and interacting with that air creep component to form these melts really rich in magnesium, but also rare earth elements. The sample that we've been looking at is magnesium sweet troctolite 76535, and it's a really famous sample. It's a beautiful sample that you can see down here. This is the troctolite from the virtual microscope. You can see the beautiful olivine crystals set in anorthite, set in with anorthite as well. This sample was taken from just outside Southpan on the Apollo 17 mission. And I really like this set of images, the cartoon and the LROC image, because it just shows you the level of detail we're able to get now with remote observation of the moon. So you can actually see the boulder trail where this big boulder fell down. There's another few boulders down here. And then the sample numbers that you see on the cartoon are where specific samples were chipped off those boulders and then brought back to Earth. So this particular troctolite is mostly composed of olivine and anorthite, as I mentioned, but it also contains trace phases like apatite, marylite, and there's some bedellite in there as well. This sample, you can't really see it in the transmitted optical light micrograph, but what we see in this sample is a lot of grain annealing and some re-equilibration. And this sample's old. It's been dated to about 4.3 billion years old. So we were most interested in looking at the apatite in this sample. We'd looked at it before in the 2016 paper and subsequent to that as well. And it showed those heavily fractionated chlorine isotope values. But the interesting thing about this particular sample is that apatite doesn't just occur in intercumulus regions like you can see here, but there's also a melt inclusion that also contained apatite, an apatite marylite intergrowth or pair within the melt inclusion inside an olivine crystal. And so what we wanted to do in this study was compare the chlorine isotope compositions of the intercumulus grains and the melt inclusion to see if we could identify any magmatic or crustal processes happening that could be fractionating the chlorine isotopes. And so by looking at the melt inclusion, we were hoping we were going to see a magmatic signature or an initial or original signature for that melt. And so we used the nanosims at NASA's Johnson Space Center to do this work, and it was published last year in American Mineralogy. For this work, we were looking at the chlorine isotopes. We also measured hydroxyl, fluorine. Oxygen is kind of our internal standard, and then carbon to navigate away from cracks. And what we find, we analyzed both intercumulus and melt inclusion apatite and find them to be almost indistinguishable in their chlorine isotope compositions. So the range that we got was plus 28 to 31 per mil, which are essentially within, almost within error. And so we saw consistency in the chlorine isotope range and the chlorine content of the apatites we looked at between different samples that we previously looked at for the intercumulus grains, but then also between the intercumulus and the melt inclusion apatite, so those occurring in different petrographic settings. And so the conclusion that we came to in the Amin paper is that it's likely that the melt before any crystallization had occurred, the melt parental to this sample already had heavily fractionated chlorine within its melt composition. And so this really corroborated the idea, not only our Urcrete idea, but also that this Troctolite, which is unshocked and very special because it's unshocked, didn't lose volatiles during any magmatic processing or crustal residence or anything like that. Okay, and so what we conclude again is that Mare results indicate the mantle had a light chlorine isotope composition, whereas any creep-rich samples like this Apollo 17 Troctolite sample have heavier chlorine isotope composition. And so what we're saying is that fractionation of chlorine isotopes was likely caused by the loss of metal chlorides from Urcrete shortly after the lunar magma ocean had finished crystallizing. And this is in agreement with other moderately volatile elements. Some recent work has looked at zinc isotopes, gallium isotopes, and also potassium isotopes, and show very similar patterns to what we're seeing. So this study by Tian that came out last year in GCA was looking at bulk rock potassium isotopes and showing that samples that have a variable creep component or enriched in trace elements also are those samples that have the highest or heaviest chlorine isotope compositions. What's interesting is that this group also looked at a lot of samples that have an impact history. And so what they're seeing is variable chlorine isotope compositions within those samples. So some of the breccias are showing very light potassium isotopic compositions, which actually agrees with some of the chlorine isotope work, which shows that some of the really brecciated regolith samples from the surface of the moon likely have deposited light chlorine within their those breccias, and so maybe these light values in the very heavily processed impact process samples are recording a light chlorine vapor deposit. Now, we've talked about the potential mechanism for obtaining Urcrete with a very heavy chlorine isotope composition. So go back to our idea of cross-breaching impact, either exposing Urcrete to the vacuum of space, allowing it to degas, or having impacts early on enough that they could weaken the crust significantly to allow the lighter chlorine isotope to escape. And so it's been suggested, we suggested initially in 2016, and it was recently, as of last week, corroborated in another study, but potentially the prosolar creep terrain, which is this really interesting geochemical anomaly on the near side of the moon. This is the near side. This is the far side of the moon. This prosolar creep terrain, or PKT, is really enriched in incompatible trace elements like thorium. It's also enriched in iron and titanium, but that maybe this area or terrain represents the site of potentially a cross-breaching impact very early, within the first 100 million years of the moon's lifetime. Yeah, and so it's not all wrapped up in a neat bow. We've drawn some conclusions based on our work, but there are a lot of unanswered questions as well. The first one is, well, okay, we've tested this idea of, air creep being heavily enriched in this heavier chlorine isotope, but what about samples from outside of that geochemical anomaly? What about samples from the feldspathic highlands, from the far side of the moon? Do they agree with that model? And this has been partly tested with meteorite samples, but while meteorite samples theoretically provide a global sampling of the moon, they're also influenced and affected by impact processes. That's how they get to Earth in the first place. And oftentimes they're from the regolith material. So a lot of times they're themselves brecciated and mixtures of different rock types that were formed on the moon and then ejected to Earth. So there are other issues that have to be untangled when dealing with meteorites. I've been talking a lot about chlorine today, but another volatile that's near and dear to my heart and that we see doesn't quite correlate with chlorine is hydrogen. So hydrogen isotopes show the opposite effect to chlorine. They're really heavily fractionated, 1,000 per mil or so, in the Mare basalts, in apatites and volcanic glass beads. But the hydrogen isotopic compositions measured in crustal samples show terrestrial-like values. And so there's clearly a decoupling of these two isotope systems in lunar systems. And so we're now trying to do correlated hydrogen chlorine measurements on the same grains to try and build up that history and understand exactly what's happening with hydrogen in relation to chlorine. We also need to better understand the behavior of volatiles in creep-rich basalt samples. The problem is they're very, they have a lot of this trace element rich, this creep component, but they're very rare in the sample collection. And so there's still a lot of unknowns about what exactly is going on in the creep-rich basalts. There are big discrepancies between bulk sample analysis versus in situ analysis, and it's not to do with necessarily the analytical technique, but it's understanding what the carriers are for chlorine in these different, in the bulk rock versus in situ. And it might be that maybe we haven't completely identified all of the chlorine hosts. And so there's a lot more work to do. And there's a paper that came out last year by Gargano et al. This is the Zach Sharp group from University of New Mexico. So there's clearly a lot more that we need to do to try and narrow the gap as to why bulk rock values for the same samples don't quite correlate with in situ measurements. And then the final question is, well, where are the metal chlorides that potentially degassed from the early magma ocean? And in samples where we can clearly see correlated chlorine isotopes and chlorine content that clearly have undergone degassing themselves as a volcanic process, where are the metal chlorides? And potentially they're found as surface coatings on some of the pyroclastic glass beads. There's a nice paper by Man Liu in 2019. And as I said, it's probably seen in some of these bulk samples. For example, in the potassium isotope system, we see some very light values that might be recording that degassed signature. We're still trying to address some of these questions here at the U of A, in particular, trying to look at samples from outside of the PKT. And so grad student Zoe Wilbur is currently working on a group of high titanium basalts from Apollo 11 and 17, which lie outside of this really thorium-rich area on the lunar near side. And we're trying to correlate the chlorine isotope compositions of those phosphates and glasses and melt inclusions with hydrogen isotopes to gain a better understanding of what's happening in the high titanium Mare basalt suite. Those samples really enriched in ilmenite. And then we're also looking at some special samples from the Lunar mission. So those were the Soviet missions that took place from 1969 through to 1976. And we're looking at Luna 16 and Luna 24 samples that again come from even further outside the prosolar creep terrain. So these should be sampling basaltic fragments that hopefully don't have any influence of this geochemical anomaly. And so undergraduate student Siobhan Morin is currently looking at these lunar basalt fragments in these soils. And then the final thing that we're doing here at the U of A is to investigate what some work that we did previously with a grad student at the Open University. Nikki Potts was looking at some Apollo 14 samples that seem to record vapor phase metasomatism happening within the crust during the formation of some of the impact-related samples that she was looking at. And so we posited whether vapor phase metasomatism was happening in the crust associated with ejecta blankets, and that was causing some weird fractionation of chlorine and other volatiles within those samples. And so we have some pretty unique Apollo 14 regolith materials that we're currently looking at here at the U of A. Okay, and with that, I'd just like to acknowledge all of my collaborators without who none of this work would be possible, to NASA's Curation Office for allocating both the Apollo and the Luna samples for this work, and then a range of different support from the UK and from NASA. And with that, I will just leave you with our unanswered questions and take any questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
There.
Thank you so much. I can moderate questions, George, unless you'd like to do so.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so as we do every week, please type in your questions in the chat or raise your hand and you can ask Jessica your question yourself. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so we have plenty of time. So please let me know about your questions. Questions?
I'll go ahead and raise my hand and ask a question, Cal.
Yeah, go for it, please.
Yeah, my question, Jess, is for missions that are happening right now or planned in the future. Is there a specific target that these missions are focusing that's going to help address this question?
For the moon?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a really great question. So right now, Artemis, which is the next big NASA endeavor to go back to the moon, is currently planning to go to the lunar South Pole, polar region, which is outside of the PKT. It's on the far side. And the idea right now is to collect rock samples from there. So it's the biggest basin on the moon, potentially sampled mantle material or exposed mantle material. And that would be interesting from, a variety of different perspectives, but for trying to understand the evolution of indigenous lunar volatiles on the moon, it would be amazing to get samples from the far side and also the lunar South Pole to tie that to, whether we can see a mantle signature, whether, do we have mantle rocks exposed at the lunar South Pole? So that in itself would be interesting, but then kind of, if I put my other hat on, which is to look at hydrogen, the lunar South Pole is a big, we have lots of permanently shadowed regions in the lunar South Pole, which are craters that don't see sunlight, and we know are really enriched in volatile elements. So like water ice is present in those permanently shadowed regions. And so there are lots of people right now proposing experiments that will fly and go and analyze in situ the ices that are there. And so for understanding the complete volatile budget of the moon, both endogenous, so trapped inside rocks, but also exogenous on the surface, and what the interaction is between those two. Those are some really important missions that will be happening. But one thing that I'm really excited to see come out within the next year is the Chang'e 5 mission landed in December of last year on the near side, within the prosolar creep terrain, but very far outside of the Apollo mission, where they landed, the landing site, potentially on the youngest one of the youngest lava flows on the moon, of about 1 billion years old, 1.3 billion years old. And so it'll be super interesting. They're, potentially creepy samples, but they're really young compared to anything else we have in the Apollo and Luna collections. And so it doesn't quite answer your question about future, but what's going on right now is that the Chinese Space Agency are analyzing those samples. And so we will hopefully know the answer to, is our hypothesis right or wrong? And then also just understanding what those samples have to offer. So.
Ananya, go for it.
Hi, Ananya.
Hey, Jess, great talk. I'm still sort of processing the
Thank you.
question as I'm sort of going to ask you. So this question actually is about this decoupling between the hydrogen and chlorine that you mentioned. And I was wondering, like, we know that the lunar mantle itself is very heterogeneous in hydrogen and probably even
Yep.
the ratios. Probably that's the same for chlorine as well, but I don't know exactly what it is for chlorine. But do you think there could be an answer about that, like what the difference between the two isotope systematics could be?
Yeah, something that's really puzzling. I think it's something to do with heterogeneity, but also I think partitioning. So yes, we find hydrogen and chlorine in both sets of samples if we just take a gross approach and say basalts and the crustal samples. But we like the crustal samples, which are much more creepy and have this residual component, they have hardly any water in them.
Yeah.
They're really, really dry. And so, but the basalts clearly have lots, and, the pyroclastic glasses samples, areas of the moon that potentially are as wet as some of the driest parts of Earth's mantle, which is still pretty wet for the moon. So I think it's to do with partitioning, maybe. So maybe the mantle is wetter than air creep. And so if you imagine the crystallization, maybe we're trapping more water in the mantle cumulate pile as the lunar magma ocean crystallizes, and maybe even in the crust, in the fan. And then when it gets to the air creep, we just don't have enough hydrogen in there, maybe. So that when we see this degassing, we're really seeing the predominance of loss of metal chloride and not seeing very much fractionation of hydrogen isotopes. At least that's how I'm trying to explain it to myself, because this is something I've been asking myself for a long time. Is we have these two isotope systems, and a lot of people study them independent of each other, but they are very much intimately connected. And so, yeah, I'm very interested in this problem and seeing what your experiments come up with.
Yeah. I was going to say, because that's what ARCA is going to be doing. So basically looking at hydrogen partition coefficients. And so if it turns out that hydrogen is really compatible in some of these cumulates really early on, then you would have maybe a much drier air creep. And that, as you said, be a solution. Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, other questions? We've got about 5 more minutes.
Oh, I can ask a couple of questions. Jessica, that was a great talk. I learned a lot. So the two questions were, so I see that there's like a few of the compositions that you showed are really, like similar to terrestrial, but like chlorine being like moderately volatile. I was wondering what do we think is the magnitude of the isotope fractionation that could be driven by just like evaporation associated, or like the kinetics of evaporation associated with the lunar forming impact? Do we think is that negligible? So would bulk initial composition of the moon be similar to the Earth?
So this is a question I don't think anyone has. So people have looked at just elemental fractionation. So what are we losing versus what are we retaining during moon formation and that very violent event that I showed you right at the beginning. But for the isotopes, it's really in its infancy, people actually incorporating those isotopes into the moon formation models and what happens in the proto-lunar disk and the vapor cloud. What's interesting is people have done those. So I don't know of any study that's done it for chlorine, but for potassium and zinc, there have been some studies that suggest that yes, you can fractionate those isotopes during moon formation as well. But what's interesting is we still see samples that record terrestrial-like values on the moon. So it clearly, if if that fractionation was happening during moon formation, it wasn't complete or widespread, which in itself is weird because you've got a completely molten or vaporized starting composition. Not all vaporized, but melt and vapor in circumlunar space to start off with. And then another interesting modeling paper that came out, I want to say 2019, by Miki Nakajima and I think it was Nakajima and Stevenson. They were looking at hydrogen and how hydrogen fractionates during moon formation. And hydrogen, you'd expect, would be, if anything was going to fractionate, you'd expect it to be hydrogen. But hydrogen isn't actually lost efficiently from the system. And so it doesn't actually fractionate that much. And so that's how we can retain, you know, a moon that might have inherited water from the Earth and not having lost it during that process, which I still find mind-blowing that you can retain something like as volatile as hydrogen during such a violent and high temperature process.
Great. Yeah, and the yeah, I guess like I was thinking about like some of those papers that like have shown like the, you know, like the heavy potassium, like heavy selenium, and like all those like moderately volatile elements as being like concentrated on the moon and just like related to like the lunar forming impact. So I was wondering if like anybody has thought about that for chlorine. And the other question is, do you know, have people looked at for example, chlorine isotopes in apatites from like terrestrial, like subvolcanic systems that have been like strongly degassed, and like something that would look similar to, you know, kind of the out, like, you know, the degassing and the fractionation on the moon? Or is that very particular to the like the creep like chemistry on outgassing?
So I'm not aware of anyone who has studied it. I would certainly be interested in exploring those possibilities and seeing what processes may or may not fractionate chlorine isotopes on Earth. As you saw right at the beginning, you know, a lot of the work, at least that I'm aware of, and I'll put my planetary scientist hat on, at least a lot of the work that I'm aware of from terrestrial studies that's been looking at chlorine isotopes has been mostly focused on looking at bulk rock samples. And so you lose something when you only do the bulk rock measurements and you're looking at either the soluble or the insoluble components. You certainly don't get any texturally constrained, you know, information. And so if there are such systems on Earth where this could be applied, then what you would want to do is look for early forming versus late forming apatites. That's something my grad student Zoe Wilbur is looking at in the lunar samples, because then that can help you understand whether it's is that something, a fractionation that happened prior to that parental melt forming, or is that something that happened during that volcanic event? And then you can correlate early and late forming things. So if anyone has those types of samples, I'd be super interested to help analyze them, because that sounds really interesting. Or maybe it's something you want to propose, Mauricio.
Yeah, I mean, that would be interesting to look at for sure. Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's one final question I'm going to ask from the chat. Arka says, very interesting talk. Is there any correlation between the mere basalt ages and fractionation of chlorine isotopes? If yes, would that mean anything, perhaps the chemical evolution of Urkrete?
That's a really good question, Arka. And actually, some people have proposed that just by plotting the ages and the chlorine isotopes, that there's a correlation, but really what they're seeing is the discrepancy in ages between the old crustal samples and the Mare basalts. Not so much, yes, there's an age correlation with chlorine isotopes within the Mare basalts themselves. It's just those two groups. But I actually argue against even that gross simplification, because it completely, it doesn't take into account the petrogenesis of the samples, which have undergone very different histories. You know, you're talking about intrusions into the crust that are very, very early on, and then relatively late forming volcanics, which have undergone very different processes from different sources in the interior. And so, yeah, it's a great question. Some people have proposed that there is, but I personally don't think we don't have enough information yet. But that's potentially something that the Chungi 5, the new Mare basalts that have just been sampled and brought back to Earth, could potentially help us understand. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for that wonderful talk. And if everyone can give a round of applause for Jessica, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. Really enjoyed it.